Hello, and welcome to our first presentation on Early Latin morphology. My name is Giuseppe Pezzini, and I teach and research on Early Latin language and literature at the University of St. Andrews. In this presentation, I will first make some brief introductory points on Early Latin morphology, and then move on to discuss word formation and derivational morphology in particular. I will also talk about compounding, agglutination or recategorization, also known as juxtaposition, univerbation or conversion. In Early Latin, word formation is merely derivative and inflectional and is mainly realized through affixes. There are also some cases of compounding, ablaut and reduplication, which I will briefly discuss, but affixation is the main form of derivation in Early Latin. Prefixes, and above all suffixes, are added to nominal and verbal roots and stems according to a more or less regular patterns. A root is the minimal unit conveying a semantic content, such as, for instance, the root loud, praise, which can be combined with suffixes and other prefixes. A stem, instead, is the root together with any derivational affixes that identify a given word or form. For instance, laudator, praiser, is the standard stem of the noun to which other suffixes are added. This forms, in fact, the stem, the basis for the regular addition of suffixes in inflectional morphology. The addition of affixes can be used in the creation of new derivative forms. That's what we will call derivational morphology of derivation, or can also be used to convey a vast range of grammatical meanings, including gender, number, case, voice, tense, mood, and that's what we will call inflection. Inflection of nouns and adjectives are known as declensions and classes, and I will talk about them in my second presentation on morphology, together with the morphology of adverbs. The inflection of verbs is known as conjugation, and this will be the subject of my third presentation on morphology. Today, I will mainly focus on derivational morphology and more generally on word formation in Early Latin. There are several main types of word formation in Latin, in order more or less of frequency: suffixation, preverbation, nominal prefixation, nominal and verbal compounding, agglutination and recategorization, also known as juxtaposition, univerbation or conversion, as already said. As regards suffixation, we must distinguish according to the grammatical category of the root to which the suffix is attached. A first subclass of suffixation includes suffixes that are attached to verbal roots. In most cases, these are nominal suffixes creating new nouns, and among which in particular I will refer to the adjunctive suffix tor, masculine, and the adjunctive suffix trix, feminine, one who does something X. I can also mention the process suffix tio, which is the act of X, of doing something, which however can also mean by metonymy the place when one does something. For instance, from the verbal stem cura, which means roughly to take care, which derives from the root cur, which is care, we find the following nominal derivatives. We find curator, the one who takes care, curatio, the act of taking care, but also we have curatrix, or better procuratrix, one who takes care, feminine. These three suffixes, tor, trix and tio, are very frequent in Early Latin, to the extent that they almost form a sort of genetic set, which can be applied to all verbal stems, almost as if we are a sort of derivative declension, let's say. So for instance, from the root facio, to do, we have factor, we have factio, and we have factrix. This genetic set, however, cannot really be considered the same as a declension. In many cases, the original meaning of the suffix has been extended or obscured. So for instance, the noun factio can still mean the act of making, but in many cases it means, by extension, a set of social connections, and it would be interesting to discuss what was the etymological origin of that. There are also plenty of verbal roots for which only two, one or none of the above form is actually attested. So for instance, for the form laudo, to praise, only laudatio is attested in Early Latin, whereas laudator and laudatrix are not. Other Somehow less frequent the verbal nominal suffixes of Early Latin are tura, which means the concrete result of something, tus, a sort of variant of tio from the semantic perspective, men and mentum, which normally mean the place where X happens. There is also forms in bulum or that I will move on. Just to give you an example, so you understand exactly how this genetic sect, or how all this affixation is not as regular as the declension system. The form curatura, from the same root cura, is attested in Early Latin, but curabulum, with the suffix bulum, does not exist, and curatus, curamen, curamentum, which are attested, but are only found in medieval Latin. That's to a certain extent is interesting because it shows that this sort of suffixation is potentially productive even if the forms are never actually attested in the language. Anyway, these are the suffixes which you find at the bottom of the slide are not very productive in Early Latin. In several cases they have undergone a process of grammaticalization which somehow obscured their original affixal nature and to a certain extent also limited their productivity. To give you just an example, from the suffix or, we have the noun power, fear, but it's quite clear that the original fixed nature of power is no longer there. There are also a couple of the verbal suffixes which form new adjectives. The most common is the one ending in bilis, which basically means able to be something. This, for instance, appears in the adjectives castigabilis, ludificabilis, ivendibilis. It is interesting to note that all the three words that you find in the slide are plotin apax legomena. That is, they are only found once and in plotos. Early Latin, and even more precisely the language of Plotus, which, as we've seen many times now, forms a big part of the corpus, is full of neologisms formed by suffixation. Another less productive type of suffixes is the set bundus and cundus, which originally meant in the progress of doing something. For instance, we find the adjective ridibundus in Plotus and Cato. Finally, in Early Latin and in Latin in general, there are few verbal suffixes that create new verbs. The most productive are the frequentative intensive suffix tare, the incotive scere, and the iterative itare. For instance, as you can see in the slide, from the root cano, in Early Latin has cantare and cantitare. From the root scior has... Sorry, I changed a bit. So okay, let's do it again because I changed a bit the text but not the slide. Okay, so I will just refer to the slide improvise.
Shall I change the slide?
If you want to do it easily, can you also... no, but that's fine. We'll leave the slide as it is and I will improvise. That's okay. So let's do it again and I will not... Yes.
You somehow stop to look at the slides.
You can use the slide, yes. Sorry.
Especially if you are reading something from the slide.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to look at that.
Okay.
Okay.
Finally, there are few verbal suffixes that in Early Latin and Latin in general are used to create new verbs. The most productive are the incotive suffix scere, the intensive suffix tare, and the iterative suffix itare. I've given you some example in the slides. So for instance, from the simple verb silere, which means to be quiet, we have the incotive form silescere or silesco, to grow quiet. From canere, to sing, we have the intensive form cantare, originally to sing loudly. And from cantare itself, we have the iterative form cantitare, to keep singing loudly, or more general, to keep singing. The second most extensive class of Latin suffixes consists of suffixes attached to a nominal or adjectival root or stem. In some cases they are used to create new nouns, but that's not very common. An example of this is the suffix culus, which is used to form diminutive nouns. This is in fact very productive in Early Latin. Even more common are the abstract suffixes ja, which is sometimes found as itia or intia, the suffix tas, the suffix tudo, like that we find for instance is sorditudo, duritudo, miseritudo, or severitudo. All these three suffixes, ja, tas, and tudo, are very productive in Early Latin, and especially in the language of Plautus. At times they can be attached to the same verbal root, producing optional variants. For instance, to give you some example from the slide, from the root miser, which means sad or unfortunate, in Early Latin we find the form miseria, but we also find the form miseritudo. A similar example is with the suffix tas. In Terence we find the form severitas with the suffix tas, but in Plautus we also find the form severitudo. The existence and distribution of these optional variants suggests that many of these are actually neologisms, which were coined by literary authors in a period characterized by a strong morphological and lexical experimentalism. Not all these forms will survive classical Latin, and in fact in many classical Latin authors of the imperial period we will all find one of the optional variants. Apart from the abstract suffixes mentioned above, which are quite common, ja, tas, and tudo, we also find some other relatively less productive denominal suffixes, which are used to form new nouns, and these are the suffixes io, edo, bra, and cum. Among the nominal suffixes used to form adjectives, the most frequent in Early Latin are listed in this slide. We have the relational jus and lis with allomorphs, which is basically equivalent almost to a genitive form. We have the suffix icus and eus. We have the diminutive suffix culus with some derivatives and allomorphs. Then we have the suffix arius, very productive in Plautus in particular. The suffix atus, the suffix osus, inus, icus, and so on. These are relatively productive. The one in the last two lines in the slide are less productive, but are still fine. Atticus, ensis, sulentus, itus, utus, and ivus. Final line, I have put you some suffixes which are no longer productive in Early Latin. What do I mean by that? By that I mean that these suffixes were usually productive in the prehistory of Latin, because they're especially found in very important lexical items of the language, like patrimonium, matrimonium, but there are not many forms, or even no forms, found in Early Latin which were not found in the early stage, or which cannot be somehow reconstructed for the early stage. Before I move on, here I have to do an important nota bene. The patterns that I have described so far may suggest to you a sort of consistency and regularity in the formation of suffixal forms. For instance, the suffix arius comes always for a particular stem. But in fact, this does not accurately describe the situation in Early Latin. There are many cases of suffixes which do not follow the patterns of word formation described above, and later on I will point to some examples. But I think I've said enough about suffixation. I will now move on to another important class of derivational morphology in Latin, that is prefixation. I will start with the prefixation of verbs, also known as preverbation. This consists in the addition to a pre-existing form of a verbal prefix, also known as preverb. Coinage of preverbial forms is very common in Early Latin, as also suggested by the number of preverbial verbs only attested in Early Latin and often apax legomena, especially found in the creative Plautine language. The most common preverbs in Early Latin, which are listed in the slide according to frequency, are cum, ex, de, ad, ob, and per, which can be combined with a verbal stem, like the one of duco, to create those verbs, conduco, educo, deduco, adduco, obduco, and perduco. Other less frequent but still common preverbs are dis, pro, prae, sub, inter, and ab. For all these preverbs, apart from this, there are corresponding prepositions, which are analogous both formally and at least originally semantically. This is interesting because it shows that somehow there is a connection between preverbs and prepositions, which ultimately derives from the fact that both of them were originally adverbs. In Early Latin, there are also some cases in which the preverb is separated by the verb. In Tumesis, we say. Some scholars wouldn't agree with what I've just said. I will posit a neater distinction between preposition and preverbs, between noun prefixes and preverbs, but I think that there is a level of artificiality in this. For this reason, I prefer to consider next as a separate yet analogous class to that of preverbs, the group of prefix, noun, and adjectives, that is, nouns or adjectives formed by addition of a prefix. The most common is a type with a negative prefix in, which is not the same as the preposition in, and this shows that somehow preverbs and preposition are similar but not completely equal. I gave you an example in the slide, the adjective invendibilis, which is in fact an apex legomenon only found in Plautus. Other prefixes for which there are corresponding preposition are the prefix per, which means very thoroughly, and the prefix sub, which means something like ish. These modify nouns, like in the slide subtristis. Other prefix found in nouns are ex, a, and de or pre, but more common are the prefixes sub, which means deputy, like subcustos from sub plus custos, or conservus with the prefix con, which means fellow something. Conservus means fellow slave. The next two classes of word formation, which are no longer affixal, are those of compounding, compounds, which involve the merging of two or more stems or roots of different words with the usual addition of grammatical suffixes. Compounding is strictly speaking not a form of affixation, but it can be considered as a form of word formation in general, also because in many cases the original lexical etymology of the two forms is now lost. An important point: compounding in Latin is not very productive, is not as productive as in Greek, for instance, but within the history of Latin language and literature in general, compounding is comparatively frequent in early Latin, and especially in tragedy and the comedy of Plautus. In fact, later on, compounding was going to become associated as a feature of early and archaic language. There are different types of nominal compounds in Latin. As I said, they are not very common, but here today I will briefly mention two important patterns which normally involve the addition of an E between the parts of the compounds, of a short T, important. The first type are compounds, nominal or adjective, with verbal roots that are almost grammaticalized as suffixes. And these are, for instance, I wouldn't call them suffixes, but they are almost behave as suffixes: fex, spex, dex, keps, ficus, dicus, ferger, and cola. And I've given you some example in the slide, like aurifex, agricola, or causidicus. A second important class is the class of possessive compounds, and I gave you some example: clarisonum magnanimus. Magnanimus means with a great-hearted, clarisonum with a clear sound. If nominal compounding is rare in Latin, verbal compounding is even rarer. The most frequent pattern is the one with the almost grammaticalized ending ficare from the root of the verb facere, and I've given you a couple of examples: causificari and fumificare. Other less common are the compounds with the forms gerare or ferrare or chinare. Many of these forms in early Latin are apex legomena and have a very clear high-style stylization to show that they are not very productive in the real language. The next type of word formation is what I will call agglutination. Other people will call it as juxtaposition or univerbation. This could also be described as a more loose form of compounding in which two independent words, not necessarily two nouns, not necessarily two roots, are merged together into a new lexical item. Some very common examples are there in the slide and are manumittere, usurandum, res publica, or animad vertere with elision, or vendere from originally venum dare with an even more extensive phonological reduction. Another example, which I think is useful to show the difference between compounding and agglutination or univerbation, is the form agricultura, which means originally the cultivation of the land and more generally agriculture. In this particular form, the E between agr and cultura is long, that is, it is a proper genitive form of the noun ager, whereas in the compound agricola, which we saw before, the E is short. This is not a grammatical ending, but it's a sort of linker which is normally found in compounds. Finally, I can briefly discuss recategorization, as I would call it, or conversion. That is the creation of new forms by changing the grammatical category of an existing form. For instance, almost all adjectives in Early Latin can be turned into nouns by nominalization of the neutral form. So, for instance, from the adjective bonus, which means good, we can find in Plautus the noun bonum, which means the good, or the opposite malus, malum. In some cases, as in malum, there is also a process of semantic development and the original etymological sense is somehow lost. Another example is from the adjective floralis, which means of the goddess of flowers. Flora, we have the noun plural with the plural neuter ending floralia, that is the festival of flora. In many cases, this change of grammatical category is accompanied by a change of grammatical ending. An example of this is the very common class of denominative verbs, which are formed from the simple addition of verbal endings, like are in particular, or the first conjugation, to a nominal root. So, for instance, from the root nomen, nomen, which means name, we have the verb nominare, from finis, the end, the verb finire, from lenis, moderate, adjective, the verb lenire, to moderate. In some cases, recategorization involves an addition of other morphological items, in particular preverbs. This is what is somehow called parasynthesis. I'll give you an example from the root eres heredis, which means hair. We have in Plautus the verb ex heredare, which means to disinherit. So we have a kind of the nominal verb heredare with the addition of the prefix ex. Before I conclude, as an epilogue, a few words on ablaut or apophony, by which I mean the change or lengthening of the root vowel for the creation of a new grammatical form. Just to give you a couple of examples, in Latin from the root of the verb tego, which means to cover, we have the noun toga, which means what covers, that is a typical dress of the Romans, the toga. Similarly, from the root of rego, which means to rule, we have the noun rex with quantitative apophony, which means ruler, the king. Ablaut or apophony is a vestige of a very common and Proto-Indo-European phenomenon, which is attested in many other Indo-European languages, such as Greek. This kind of derivation with ablaut is not very productive in Early Latin. We know that it was productive in the prehistory of Latin, but in Plautus, for instance, there are almost no cases of this sort of original coinage, original word formation with this sort of ablaut. I think this is enough for word formation and derivational morphology in particular. Thanks for listening. Next class we'll continue with morphology and we'll be talking about the inflection of names. As we say in Early Latin, gratias vobis ago.